I study how politics and ideology impacts firms and important corporate decisions. And so a key takeaway from my research is that ideology or partisanship affects much more than just who we vote for, but that it shapes our economic thinking, how we see the economy, for example, and important economic and financial decisions. And importantly, since I don't study households, but important decision makers such as CEOs, it shows that kind of financial literacy doesn't protect you from ideological bias or partisan bias creeping into your decisions. Yeah, so partisan trading is the phenomenon that we study in this new paper, which shows that CEO ideology impacts which countries firms trade with. And so in particular, it's alignment with foreign governments that seems to be important for a CEO's willingness to engage in foreign trade. Yes, in an earlier work with my co-authors, we studied changes in the political composition of executive teams in the US. And we saw this big trend towards more partisan segregation. So more Democrats working only with Democrats, Republicans with Republicans. And so that kind of raises the question, how does partisanship impact firm managers and the decisions that they take? And this is kind of the question that we took on in this project. Yeah, so what we see is that when CEOs are more ideologically aligned with the government and power in a foreign country, they are more likely to maintain a trade relationship with that country. So they're more likely to trade. And vice versa, they compared to when they're misaligned, they're more likely to reduce trading activity. And so to give you an example, what the empirical setup that we exploit is close foreign elections. So kind of see how Democratic and Republican CEOs change their trading behavior around an election that switches the government from right to left or left to right. So to give you an example, in 2013 in Italy, there was an election that led to a change in the government from center-right to center-left. So what that means for Republican-led firms, this would be an increase in ideological distance, decrease in ideological distance for Democrats. And then what we see is that Democratic-led firms were more likely to continue trading with Italian firms after that election. Yeah, so there are two ways, I think, to interpret that result. One is you could see shorter-term relationships as being kind of a proxy for lower switching cost. So it's easier to kind of substitute that short relationship with a new relationship. Whereas if you have a really long established relationship with a foreign trade partner, you might be less willing to give that up for ideological reasons. Another way to think about that result is that if you have a longer trade relationship, you might have more information about that country that you can rely on when you're making these decisions, so that your political gut reaction to the election outcomes might be just less influential. So there's, either switching cost or, information, quality of the information that you have could explain why we see stronger effects for shorter relationships. Yeah, so we see economic costs, first of all, for the foreign trade partners. So we see that when US CEOs experience an increase in ideological distance, our main result is that they reduce trading. And we see this is very costly for their foreign trade partners. There's a 9% decline in their export revenues. These are very export-heavy, reliant firms. And so they're very much impacted. Not in their export revenue, but their export revenue very much so. US firms firms themselves are less affected on average, but once we zoom in on the firms with high import or export exposure, we see that when they're highly strong importers, we see their cost margins go up by about 1% when ideological distance increases. And we also find revenue effects for both firms with strong export and import exposure. So also for the US firms themselves, once we zoom in on those with very high foreign trade exposure, we see economic effects suggesting that this tendency to reduce trade when ideological distance increases is actually not in their economic interests. I think our results highlight an important friction to trade that hasn't received as much attention. Of course, we've heard a lot about government-imposed restrictions, and that has been studied a lot, such as tariffs and sanctions, and these are very important for foreign trade activity. But our results suggest that there's another friction, which is actually, doesn't have to be to do with anything that the government maybe does to restrict trade, but it's kind of voluntary trade restrictions that are coming from the private firms themselves, and the channel is through the ideology of their leaders. I think it shows that ideology can pose a barrier to trade, and importantly, what we see is that when firms experience an increase in ideological distance, they actually contract their foreign trade network. So they trade with fewer foreign partners, their networks become more concentrated, and so this raises questions about vulnerability of those networks if they become more concentrated, and it's essentially contributing to a narrowing of supply chains via the channel of ideology. Yeah, we have evidence that the COs that experience an increase in ideological distance perceive these countries as riskier. And we have evidence from that on conference calls where we can see how often do they measure risk, do they mention risk in the context of talking about these countries that they trade with. And definitely they're more likely to mention risk when ideological distance goes up. So what we think is going on is that they are not, maybe consciously making, a politically motivated decision, but that their ideology clouds their economic thinking, and that if they see a government that's more that's implementing policies that's more aligned with their own worldview, they just, think that that country is in safer hands, and there's less likely less likely to be disruptions or very negative states of the world in that country. So I don't think it's symbolic for the reasons that I said. That what I think is going on is that they're thinking they're making economic decisions or financially driven decisions, but that ideology kind of clouds our view of the economy and shapes it. And so this is why I don't think they're strategic in the sense that they are hoping to make kind of affect political outcomes or make a political statement, but that they are thinking they're making effectively an economic decision. Yeah, so I don't think we're at the point yet where we can make very concrete policy suggestions, but I do think there are at least two concerns that are raised by our results. One is, as I mentioned, this fact that we see narrowing of trade networks when ideological distance goes up, and so that certainly raises questions about, does this make disruptions more likely, kind of expose them to more risks, individual country risk if they're trading with fewer partners. So that's one concern. The other concern that we would like to explore more is that it's kind of gives for US CEOs quite a bit of influence over, foreign trade partners and potentially also the local economies in those countries, given that we see very large economic effects on their trade partners. If the large US firms stop trading with you, that has negative outcomes for the firms. And so understanding more, how does this affect actually the local economy in these countries and potentially even, influence future political outcomes is something that we would love to understand better.